Hey guys, Jay here, welcome to Eons of Battle, and today I'm going to show you how I painted a retro, vintage, out-of-production white metal Chaplain. Here are the paints I'll be using. So I'm really excited to get my hands on this out-of-production Chaplain. I'm starting a small collection of Chaplains for my Black Templar army, and I'm really excited to get some of these old-school models. The first thing I did was I cut it out of its blister, and I took a look at it. Now the nice thing about white metal models is that you can bend anything back into position. I found that his Crozius was pretty well mangled by the years spent in the packaging, and so I just carefully used my fingers to bend it back straight. Now I decided to attach it to a modern 40K 32mm base, and so I carved out the slot that he usually fits into on the old style bases, and then I made myself up a little bit of milliput. Milliput is a two-part epoxy that's really nice for doing some basing where you need it to have a really strong foundation. So I mixed up just enough so that I could add a little bit of a mound to this base because I like my hero models to stand just a little bit taller than the rank and file infantry, and I just kneaded the two-part epoxy back and forth until it was ready to work with. I applied a small drop of superglue to the base, and then I applied the milliput. And then I just stuck him right into the base, and then I used a little bit of superglue to make sure that he would stay there. While the milliput was still soft, I decided to add a few small decorations. I'm going to be adding one of these retro knives and a small orc skull out of the new Citadel Skulls box. I cleaned these two pieces up, and then I decided that I want the knife to be sticking up out of the sand that the model's going to be standing in. And so I cleaned the mold lines off of the model, decided where I was going to put it, and then I very carefully clipped off the very tip, applied just a drop of superglue, and then stuck it into the soft milliput. And then I did the same thing, supergluing the orc skull down to the milliput. Now I wanted my Chaplain to be holding a plasma pistol, but I didn't want to put on one of the modern plasma pistols, so I actually found a plasma pistol that looked a bit retro out of the Space Marine Mark III Power Armor Kit. I needed a little bit of green stuff to help me pose the arm how I wanted it. And then I cut off one of these retro arms that I'm going to be using for the model. I cleaned all the mold lines off, which were fairly heavy because this is an old model. And then I decided how I wanted it to be posed on the base. I applied a small drop of superglue, a little ball of green stuff, and then I attached the retro arm. I cut off the fist so that I could replace it with the plasma pistol hand. I glued the arm to the model, and then I used a little bit of plastic glue to attach the plasma pistol. I then used a silicone brush to help smooth out the green stuff so that it wasn't too noticeable on the model. Then I prepared the shoulder pad. I'm using one of the retro shoulder pads out of the box because I wanted to keep as much of this retro as I could. And then to get it posed just right on the model, I applied a little dot of green stuff with a little bit of superglue. And this is just going to help the shoulder pad get a nice bond to the model. Then I applied some flocking material to the base. I covered the base in Elmer's glue. And then I'm going to be applying some of my basing sand grit. First, I put on just a sprinkling of some small pebbles, and then I finished it with some fine sand. Now the model is ready for painting. I primed the model black. And then once that black primer was done, I began painting the model. The first thing I'm doing is I'm painting his black power armor, and the way I'm doing this is I am starting with black, and then I am very slowly adding some Vallejo Stonewall Gray to my black, and I'm going to be highlighting it slowly in layers until I get up to a 50-50 mix of black and Vallejo Stonewall Gray. Now I'm trying to apply this paint into areas that I think light would be naturally falling on the model. This first layer is going to be pretty thick, covering a lot of the black primer underneath. But as I slowly work my way up to a lighter and lighter shade of gray, I'm going to be applying less and less paint in every coat. Now, when you're layering like this, I would say it's important to mix up a new color for every new lighter layer that you're applying, because if you just keep adding paint to the original, then it's going to be more difficult if you make any mistakes or you want to go back and try to get a better blend. You're going to have to mix up a new color. I found that I had gone from the black armor to a 50-50 mix in about 5 coats. As I'm applying these highlights, I'm making smaller and smaller alterations to every time I lighten my color. I'm hoping to get a very natural look that the higher edges of the armor are getting hit with a little bit more light than the undersides. I made sure to pick out other areas that need high detail, like his fingers, and like some of the smaller areas of his armor, like his gauntlets, because I want these to draw a little bit more attention. Once I was happy with how his black armor looked, I then moved on to my next color, which is going to be painting a bone color onto some of the skulls and his helmet on the model. I started out with a base coat of Vallejo chocolate brown. I found that this covered nicely in about 2 coats. I painted his helmet, both of his knee pads, and his crotch skull. I then highlighted this color with a little bit of Vallejo Beastie Brown, making sure to leave the chocolate brown in all of the recessed areas. The paintbrushes I used to paint this Chaplain are Rosemary & Co. Synthetic Series 313. I purchased a lot of Rosemary & Co. brushes, and I really like all of them, but I particularly enjoy these because they have a much thicker handle. For 90% of this model, I'm using a number 1, but for some of the larger areas, I used a number 2, and for the smallest details, I used a number 0. I then began highlighting those areas with a 1-to-1 mix of Beastie Brown and Bone White. I highlighted this in the same way that I highlighted the black power armor, adding more and more Bone White to my Beastie Brown until I was working with just Bone White. I made sure to especially highlight the top of his heads, the very top of the skulls on his knees, and I very carefully picked out the teeth on his knee pads. Finally, I did a highlight of just Vallejo Bone White. Then I base coated his book in some Vallejo chocolate brown, and I began to base coat his shoulder pad so that I'm going to be highlighting in the same way that I highlighted his helmet. Starting with a chocolate brown, working my way up through Beastie Brown, and then finally finishing off with a Bone White. On the book, I'm going to be doing my final highlight in Beastie Brown, making sure to leave plenty of the chocolate brown underneath showing to give it some definition, and a little bit of the black primer showing in the recesses. I continued to slowly bring up the colors on the shoulder pad, and then I also very carefully picked out all of the pages of his book with some Bone White. I then painted his Crozius. I decided to help add a little bit of interest to his Crozius. I painted stripes of P3 Murderous Magenta. I liked how this looked, but I thought it was a little bit too eye-catching, and so to help tone it down a little bit, I watered down some Murderous Magenta and I added it to the handle to help blend the stripes together and to make it stand out a little bit less. It took about 2 or 3 thin coats of watered down Murderous Magenta to get it looking a little bit less bright. I then started to pick out some of the metal areas. I'm using some Games Workshop Lead Belcher. Games Workshop Lead Belcher is one of the best metal paints that I have ever used. I've used a lot of metal paints from other companies, and plenty of the Games Workshop metal paints leave a lot to be desired, but Lead Belcher is an excellent color, which always gives me a good coat in one try. With this Lead Belcher, I picked out most of the skulls that had not already been painted on the model, the topper of his Crozius, and I painted the trim on his leg armor. I also used this to paint all of the areas that exist in between his armor. I also used Lead Belcher to paint his plasma pistol. I then gave all of the areas I coated with Lead Belcher 2 heavy coats of Nuln Oil. I could have slowly worked my way up and done a highlight on the metal similar to how I did the armor, but I kind of feel like it looks a little bit more retro to just apply a heavy coat of metal paint. I painted the trim of his shoulder pad with a base coat of Games Workshop Corn Red. Red and black is the color scheme of my Templar, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get a lot of red on this model, so I thought adding it to the trim of his shoulder pads would be a nice way to get some red in there. After 2 thin coats of Corn Red, I then added a little bit of a highlight with some Vallejo Bloody Red to the uppermost parts of the shoulder pad. And then I began painting my free-handed Templar cross. Now, freehanding is very difficult, and it's hard to explain how to do it, but basically you just go back and forth, adding some paint and then fixing it later. So as I go back and forth adding some black, I then go back in with the bone white and make any corrections that I can, and then I go back in with the black paint to fix those areas. It's slow and difficult, but I think the results are worth it. As you can see here, I didn't think I got good enough points on the ends of my crosses, so I went back in with some bone white, and now I'm fixing it again with the black. Then I used some Games Workshop Corn Red to pick out his eyes. And then I added a little bit more highlighting with some Vallejo Bloody Red. I also highlighted his eye lenses with Bloody Red. Then I painted the plasma coils of his plasma pistol with some Vallejo Heavy Blue. And then I began to do the freehanding of the other symbol which I wanted to be white, but I thought that white would draw the eye too much, and so I'm actually doing it in Vallejo Stonewall Gray. I'm doing this exactly the same way as I did the previous symbol, working slowly and carefully, going back and forth, making lines, and then making corrections to those lines. Then I mixed some Vallejo Heavy Blue with P3 Marrow White, and now I am highlighting just the raised portions of the plasma pistol. And then I did a final highlight with some pure P3 Marrow White. This is going to add a nice glowing effect, and it's pretty easy too. Finally, I picked out the eyes of his lenses with a little dot of P3 White, and I also dotted the tip of his plasma pistol to look like it was glowing on the inside. And that is the Chaplain fully painted. I based him the same way that I base all of my Black Templars, with some Vallejo earth and then a dry brushing of bone white. I painted the banner off camera. I used the same methods that I used to paint his body. For the backpack, I used highlights with Stonewall Gray over black, and the way I painted the banner, I painted the same way that I painted the Templar symbols on the body of the Marine. Very carefully going back and forth, freehanding and then correcting the free-handed brushstrokes. I'm really excited to add this Chaplain to my collection. I love painting these old school models because they paint up very differently to the new sculpts. They have very few details and crazy character from being hand sculpted way back in the day. Also, you cannot claim that there is not enough skulls on this model because I counted 22 skulls on his armor. I hope you enjoyed the video and you got a little dose of nostalgia. If you have any suggestions on videos that you would like to see us do, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed following along with this tutorial, and you've had any experience painting old or retro models, please post them on Instagram and tag EonsOfBattle so that we can share it. Thanks for watching.